It's absolutely lovely to be here. I'm going to talk to you this morning about reading for pleasure, but going right back to the beginning in terms of shared reading and shared reading with children. Certainly, one of my earliest memories in terms of reading for pleasure is being read to as a child. Do many of you remember being read to? Are the people here in this room that, yeah, I'm probably reading to children yourselves. I loved being read to and therefore became a very sort of passionate reader myself. This is research. Sample size of 1, I believe this was the connection. I then went on to have 2 boys, read to them throughout the, almost up into secondary school, and neither of them will go anywhere near a book. And I just realized that this is just how it is. Nevertheless, there is, I think, something very, very special about reading with the children, and that really has been one of the key motivators for my research in just understanding shared reading practices in the home and what that really means in terms of the whole reading for pleasure agenda. So that's what I'm going to be talking about this morning. Okay, so shared reading in families. I'm going to start off by telling you something that you know already, and that is it's good to read to small children. There is a mass of literature out there that will actually look at the whole concept of reading with children and why it is so important and what children actually get from it. Children who are read to regularly before they start school, more likely to learn language faster, more likely to have a larger vocabulary, more likely to be successful readers in school. I realise that many of these terms are quite contentious, so I'm just going to sort of pause with that for a minute. But, that success in reading at school. Shared reading tends to generate more kind of complex talk. There's a difference in the kind of talk that you may engage with children when engaged in shared reading. But also, and I'm sure many of you will relate to this as well, but there's that opportunity for the whole kind of relationship, the sitting down with a child, the being close, the talking. And again, lots of this has come out in the research. So fundamentally, we know that it is good to read with young children. How do we encourage it? How do we encourage families to read with their children? Well, again, as I'm sure you're aware, and I'm sure there are people here in this room who have also been, involved with these kind of interventions. Many interventions have indeed taken place, many of them very, very good, very successful interventions to try and encourage parents to read with their children. And that really is part of the grounding for my research, is to kind of, understand more about shared reading in order to, inform intervention. Some interventions have focused on things like, the quality, and others have focused on just trying to get parents to read with their children. But I think there is a little bit of a problem sometimes with intervention. And I know I'm being filmed, so I need to be cautious, but sometimes some of the Joe Frost, you will sit down, you will read with your child, that kind of very top-heavy, we're the experts, we know this is right, we're going to tell you what you should be doing, is perhaps not terribly helpful. And that really has been part of my concern in the whole concept of encouraging families to read with their children. The literature also underlines this as well. Many reading interventions don't work. And when I think you start to kind of understand families and look at families, then maybe it's not a complete surprise really why some of these kind of interventions don't work. So what I'm interested in really is looking at the whole concept of supporting families, but maybe from the other way round. So rather than it being a case of bringing in interventions and telling families, this is what you should be doing, my research really is about starting with the family, understanding shared reading practices, because actually, surprisingly, there's been very, very little research in just understanding what it is that families already do. And really, with a view to that understanding, therefore informing interventions, if that makes sense. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about. So my own study, and I'll explain in a minute that it is part of a larger project, but my own study has been to essentially understand the barriers to shared reading. Now again, I'm saying that with caution, because what I discovered almost immediately once I started the research is that even though my interest was kind of in understanding what might prevent families from reading with their children, actually that in itself wasn't terribly helpful. It really is more about understanding families, understanding what actually takes place. So it's a case of exploring shared reading practices and some of the barriers that might occur to that, to investigate how shared reading fits or does not fit within the concept of, and the construct of everyday life, but also to make sure that this study was carried out within a socially and culturally mixed sample. The way in which middle-class families may read with their children might be quite different to middle-income, low-income families. So again, just having that kind of understanding of different kinds of families was going to be really important. So the overall study, like I say, is part of a much bigger study. 8 studies, multidisciplinary. I've been working with people in psychology, linguistics, education, English, speech and language therapy, people from 4 different universities. And the whole project has been trying to understand how shared reading promotes child language development. But I have to say my study within this has been a little bit different, because my study has been very much about trying to understand families and understand, like I say, some of the barriers to shared reading, or understanding some of the ways in which families do or do not read with their children. So for my study, the methodology was very, very important. So in terms of how we spoke to families, it had to be in their homes. I had 2 fantastic research assistants working with me who were amazing at just going into people's homes and just striking up conversation. So really, it was not about going in and sort of saying, do you read? In fact, we didn't even mention the word reading really for about the first half an hour of the conversation. It was very much about understanding family. So very much about, what do you do together when you're at home? What kind of things do you do? I think this ties in very closely with what you were saying about just the everydayness of it, the life, what kind of activities that they engage in. Talk me through a typical day. And then kind of understanding how home reading practices did or did not fit within that. So that really was, very much, so really the structure of the interviews, was really critical in this study. Obviously, there's been a number of findings. Some of you might remember that I started to present some very preliminary findings almost 2 years ago. You're pleased to know that things have come on since then, otherwise it would be a bit irrelevant asking me back. But one of the things that I wanted to, obviously there's many things I could talk about, but one of the things I wanted to focus on specifically for this presentation was just, I suppose, something I found particularly interesting, and that was the relationship between parents' own relationships with reading and the kind of reading that they did with their children. And I must confess, this probably originated from a massive assumption that I was making that was actually, that was disproved really, that if parents had unhappy relationships with reading themselves or been unsuccessful with reading themselves, they might be less likely to read with their children. And in actual fact, as I will show you from a little bit of the data, that was proved to be very, very much not the case. But the kind of questions that were at the heart of this, what motivates parents to read with their children? Does their, what might prevent them from reading with their children? Is it, their unhappy relationships with reading themselves? Does their own reading relationship, does their own relationship with reading, that's a better way around, does that influence the reading relationship that they might have with their children or not? And particularly if parents had poor relationships with reading, as for example in school, and I'm sure many of you have seen children who have poor relationships with reading. As a previous class teacher, I know I certainly have. Does this prevent them from reading with their own child? So I do have a few numbers, and I want you to again treat these with caution, because really it was just a very blunt-ended tool that helped me to initially understand the data. But when I did a little analysis and tried to kind of understand, we'd ask parents to talk about their own, reading, where they read to as a child, those kind of questions. Did they read now? How did they feel about reading? Those kind of things. Essentially, 2/3 of the families that we worked with, I should have said we worked with 29 families. 2/3 of the families basically said that they'd loved reading, had read themselves as a child, and went on to read with their children. Roughly 1/3, interestingly, said that they'd had a very poor relationship with reading, that they themselves did not enjoy reading. and yet they'd gone on to actually have very successful reading relationships with their children. So that's actually that's the cohort that I'm going to focus on for the rest of this presentation, really, because I think that's where, that real kind of interest of mine, in terms of what was it, that happened for those parents and what really motivated them to go on and read with their children, given the fact that they themselves appeared to have not had, a positive relationship with reading. You still with me? Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a little bit, just 3 sort of examples from the data that I thought was particularly interesting in highlighting some of this. So I'm going to begin with Natalie, 28-year-old single mother, lives with 2 sons, aged 3 and 8. Natalie's currently at home full-time, but plans to return to her job as a classroom assistant when her youngest starts school. So when we spoke to Natalie about her own reading as a child, because we talked to them about their own reading as a child and their own reading sort of now, this was the kind of thing that she was saying. Oh, I never read when I was younger, ever. I don't think it interested me. I think we've all met children like that, yes? I've got certain memories in English where I couldn't read certain words. And I used to have to ask the teacher, and obviously you don't want to have to ask the teacher in front of other kids. This to me, I thought was very, very relevant. I think there are many children who've had those kind of experiences. Certainly in a lot of my research, I've talked to adults who just remember that fear of being in school and being made to stand up and, having a text that they had to read aloud and reading ahead to try and get the words right. So that kind of thing, I think, was not a surprise. But then when talking to her about her own reading now, well, no, I'm not a reader really. I read autobiographies, but I don't really sit and read. I wouldn't go out and purposely buy a book. Again, I think this is interesting in the light of your work, because actually reading autobiographies is not seen as being reading. Obviously she's thinking novels. This is what being a reader is. So again, I think that in itself, I think is quite interesting. So it comes, the kind of data that we got when talking about her reading relationship with her own child. Again, you can see a much, much more positive picture. It's our little bonding time, really, that time together. It goes off books as well. Just because we've got books in our hand, we talk about the rest of the day. I'm just going to pause there, because that kind of comment was a comment that we heard time and time again, that reading wasn't just about the book. It was about that time, being with that child, spending time, talking about the day. And actually, the book itself was part of that process. Again, it's like we've spoken beforehand, but again, the object itself was part of it, but it wasn't the whole picture. We get a story, but then that's our time. Rory will tell me everything that he's done. He always wants to tell me everything that's happened so he can stay up longer. He'll make sure we get it in that time. So again, you can see how precious that was. Next. I enjoy reading more now with the kids because I'm excited to do different things with them, thinking of things I could do with a book. And I'm learning about new authors as well. Like, it wasn't something that I was that interested in, so it's nice now. I look at the stories and I'm looking for more books that authors wrote and I think he might enjoy. I never used to do that, just got books that look good on the cover. Now again, I find that fascinating, because what you've got here is a mum who's actually learning about reading for pleasure through the context of reading with her child. He's enjoyed that book. I'll actually go and look for another author. I'll understand something about the books. So again, I found that very interesting. But then when asked about her own reading now, I feel okay. I picked it up more as I've gone along. I'm more confident now with the kids than when I was younger. I think I'm good at reading now. I hope so. And again, I thought that was a lovely example of how, for this particular lady, she'd become more confident through the context of reading with her child. So, second case, Kylie. I say age between 31 to 35 because we looked at brackets. It's not that I didn't actually know which number it was. So she lived in a low-income area in Liverpool with her son Bradley, who was aged 3 years, 10 months, her husband, a builder, and an 11-year-old daughter. Recently begun part-time work at a hairdresser's and no formal educational qualifications. So again, own reading as a child, the kind of things we got from her. Like many of the parents, no, I was never really read to. Mum never sat and read to us. I can remember reading out in class and I wasn't confident. Again, this same story coming back again. Wasn't confident around them, and I'm still not. Don't enjoy reading, not out loud, but kids' books are fine. So again, you've got that, no, I don't read, I don't do it. But actually, the children's books were giving her confidence. And again, talking about her own reading. Well, you know, when people go on holiday and get into a book, I just can't get into one, you know. I think it's from not reading when I was younger. So again, you've got this kind of underlining of, you know, I'm not a reader. I don't, somebody else does that, but I don't do it. Yet, again, a very, very positive picture in terms of her own reading with her own child. Now, the word that Kylie tended to use over again was easy, which I think is fascinating when you look at the difficulties she was talking about in terms of her own reading as a child herself. It's so easy. It was almost like this is revelation. It's so easy to read with him. I love reading with him. I love doing things like that. And again, I think this is lovely. I think it's one of the easiest things you can do, because you can sit and read for half an hour or 5 minutes. It's just something you can fit in. There's no cleaning up afterwards. You just put the book back and get on with it. You can always feel the pain of, like, we've done the cooking, we've done the Play-Doh, you know, but actually books, you know, it's easy, it's clean, it doesn't take long. You can just do it. You can do it while the tea's being cooked, just things like that. And we do it just because his books are out and he'll go and get them. When they want to read, you can't say no. And again, this was a message that came back to us time and time again, that it was very, very much child-led. The children are saying, read to me. And, you know, and this is what is encouraging, motivating the parents to want to do it. So the final example I want to talk about is this lady, Hadra. Again, a little bit different, early 30s, lives with her husband, 2 children. You don't need all the details. Hadra and her husband, both Asian British. Neither Hadra nor her husband have formal educational qualifications. They married when Hadra was 16. So it just gives you a little bit of background. Now, Hadra was interesting because, again, talking about her own reading as a child, I used to struggle a lot with reading, again, that kind of story. Reading, no, not with my parents. That's not something that we did. And again, this is important because culturally, a lot of families said, well, that's just not part of our culture. We don't do that. So again, from the perspective of educationalists, this kind of belief that this is the right thing to do, well, maybe that just doesn't fit with certain cultures. It reminds me very much of Liz Brugger's work. But Hadra, unlike the other 2, did start reading as a teenager. And actually, she was very, very funny because she then talked about really getting into books. She talked about her own reading now as being out of control. It's almost like she's now got to this part where she reads and reads and reads. And then I've cut this down, but then we had this whole kind of stream of consciousness. I had a period when I had to stop reading because sometimes I don't know where to stop. And if there's housework that he's doing, you know, and I'm not sleeping, and I've got work in the morning, I just have to stop, you know. And so it just went on, and this kind of like, you know, realization. What was interesting about this couple was that Hadra did, not surprisingly, read with her child. She talked about her daughter loving books. She also talked about the bedtime story as being critical. It happens regardless of anything else. Very much talked about it being built into everyday life. All that, you know, really interesting. But what I found particularly interesting was actually, it was the husband in this couple that tended to read with the daughter. So even though Hadra was an avid reader herself now, actually it was the husband that tended to read, and he himself was not a reader. So when she was talking about her husband and the reading that her husband did with the daughter, so he gets her changed and reads the book and then just tells her some stories, asks her about her day. So they talk, I wouldn't say rubbish, but they talk randomly, and then he'll tell a story and I take her up to bed. So again, we're getting, again, the same kind of story coming up, that the husband, who is not a reader himself, but is very much enjoying that shared reading experience, activity with the daughter. But again, it's not just about the book. It's about talking. It's about the closeness. It's about the day. So again, I think, you know, those stories coming together. So trying to bring all that together, what am I trying to say, putting all this together? Well, there's certain things that sort of jump out at me from this point. One thing that I think was really very, very positive about the data, adults who reported that they either had not been readers or did not like reading or had had poor reading experiences themselves at school can and do go on to have enjoyable shared reading relationships with their children. And like I said, to me this was, I don't know why, but it was relatively unexpected, and that's something that was really lovely to see in the data. What I'm starting to think is that actually this experience of reading to a child does appear to be quite a different animal, really. So that reading that you might do at school, and again you might think, well, maybe that's because reading at school is much more formulaic, it's much more about the assessment, it's much more about getting things right. But actually sitting down and reading to a child and just enjoying it and having fun and talking about the day is a different kind of experience. Which is why tongue-in-cheek I'm saying reading to a child is not necessarily about reading, and that really is the school discourse reading that I'm talking about there. And for many families, reading is just embedded in everyday practice. And for the last few minutes, I've got another 5 minutes, I just want to just to talk a little bit about that really, in terms of the ways in which, from this data, that I started to kind of understand that rather than sort of going into families and understanding, how they read, it really is about understanding about how reading was part of doing family. And that's just what I want to talk about for the last few minutes. So what we started to find was that reading was very much a family practice. It was part of everyday life. Again, I've talked about this data already, but just as a reminder. So Natalie, it's our bonding time. It's our time. Again, that word time coming up. It goes from books, but just because we've got books, we'll talk about the rest of the day. Family practice. Kylie's saying it's one of the easiest things that you can do. You can do it while the tea's being cooked. Again, part of everyday family practice. And Hadra is just trying to sort of build it into a day, sort of reading stuff being part of the day, rather than actually learning how to read. So again, she's making that very deliberate kind of disconnect really between learning to read and actually shared reading. Also, I won't go into this in lots of detail, but shared reading, part of everyday practice. Families used it in all kinds of different ways. Families used it to cement routines. This is where we only incorporated it into the routine so that she would know bath, book, bed, for her to identify bedtime. I don't think anyone would sleep if we didn't have books. And that was where this came from. So families using it in order to cement routines. They used it to establish rules, rewards, punishment. And I'm not advocating this, but if you've been naughty, I tell you, it's your bedtime story that's going to go. So that whole kind of using it as part of that everyday discourse. And interestingly, it also sent that message about just being family. And in this case, this lady was telling us that, she now has, she's separated from her husband, now has a new boyfriend. She was saying about the boyfriend reading with the child. And actually that reading meant that they were doing family. He's much better, laughs more when he does it. He's got better voices. She would like 10 books. She's excited, loves it. Her dad doesn't do anything like that. So she looks at Jamie, I don't want to say his dad, but like his own daughter. So again, really interesting data that's kind of suggesting that shared reading is part of just doing family. As we've also said, it appeared to have, quite a strong influence in some ways on the parents' own confidence in reading. Natalie, I enjoy reading more now with the kids. I'm learning about new authors, like it wasn't something I'm interested. I'm good at reading now. And Bina, this is somebody else, I'm learning now. There are so many things, like so many stories I've read now, which I've never read in my life before. So again, that kind of flipping, that actually the shared reading experience was actually supporting the parents themselves and their reading. So, conclusions and trying to sort of pull together some of the implications for intervention. It's making me think that rather than thinking of intervention as being something that we have to do to families, rather than intervention encouraging families to do shared reading, we need to firstly understand how shared reading is part of doing family. And to me, that seems to be a very critical first step. Recognise that for many families, shared reading is actually a very different experience, perhaps from parents' own reading or how they perceive reading. I feel that there is definitely a need to encourage parents to find ways of just enjoying, again, that the word enjoyment is absolutely crucial in all this, enjoying that shared reading, enjoying that experience with their child. The extent to which the book is there, not irrelevant, but it's part of a whole process. Valuing the shared reading as an enjoyable activity. And again, either encouraging parents to carry on or even begin, if that's the case, just to read in ways that suit them, you know, how they want to do it, and ways that suit them and their child. And that's the end of that. Thank you.